Cheerio! In this video we're going to be talking about utilitarianism. I know, what a surprise. We're going to be using this more informal setting than usual because we're going to be talking about things that are not standard theory, so I feel more comfortable this way. In particular, we're going to focus on the act consequentialist model we have been using up until now to define good and bad actions. When we calculate the foreseeable utility an action can produce, we include all possible foreseeable consequences the action can lead to. Of these consequences, we notably explicit the interaction our action has with current societal norms. That, of course, is just a part of the foreseeable outcomes, but we single it out because it tends to be ignored or forgotten. I quite like this way of doing things, firstly because I believe it's one of the better ways to look at the consequences of actions. If a utilitarian stops at a red light with his car in a city, and then notices that there is no one coming from either side of the intersection, the moral action is not to cross the intersection since by waiting one is mildly suffering. It's to wait. Why? In part because the consequences of the action of waiting signals to the other members of society that the traffic light rule creates happiness, so we don't want to undermine it. One can see it the other way around too. If a black man in the 1960s chooses to utilize in protest a restroom for whites only, his action would not be equivalent to using a restroom deemed for blacks. Because one of the consequences of using the restroom deemed only for whites is to erode a harmful societal rule that keeps a minority segregated. Although the action of taking a piss is the same in both cases, we see that because of the interaction with societal norms, the consequences are different. Simply put, if one performs an action that breaks a societal rule, the undermining of a societal rule is a sometimes major part of the consequences of the action. Sometimes this component is forgotten because often one can only erode a societal rule very little. But the utility attached to societal rules is often extremely large, so even eroding a rule a tiny bit can lead to consequences worth accounting for. At some point during the making of a utilitarian playlist, I discovered thanks to a viewer that this way of looking at utilitarian calculations is very similar to another version of utilitarianism called precedent utilitarianism. In a precedent utilitarian framework, the precedent's actions set are to be taken account of when looking at the consequences of actions. Okay, whatever, this last part was just a curiosity. Now the point of this video is that there is another reason why I like expliciting the rule erosion component in the felicific calculus, and this other reason I will presently try to explain. First, let us define a version of utilitarianism that doesn't take into account the interaction an action may have with societal rules or precedents set. A version that limits the consequences of an action to the most immediately apparent ones. Let's call this version naive utilitarianism. In my experience, naive utilitarianism is often what is colloquially thought of utilitarianism. Critics especially like to consider this version of the theory when tearing it down or devising counterexamples. We can notice that naive utilitarianism is generalized by a way of calculating utility considering our equation as a function of big R. If we set big R equal to 0, we recover naive utilitarianism. Of course, if we do not consider the utility value societal rules produce, then there is no rule erosion component. This goes as expected. Now let us also define a basic version of deontology. In a deontological framework, morality is defined by a set of rules. In a basic version, if you break a rule, then you have acted immorally. If you follow the rules instead, then you have acted morally. In this basic framework, the morality of actions is binary. An action is either good or bad. There is no continuum of numbers we can assign to actions to weigh them against each other. Let's call this basic version of deontology naive deontology. We can now notice that naive deontology is also generalized by a way of calculating utility. If we set big R equal to plus infinity for the rules defined by the naive deontology framework, we obtain a model that is isomorphically equivalent, that mimics exactly the binary version of morality given by a basic version of deontology. Actions that break the rules will be considered immoral, minus infinity, and actions that follow the rules will be considered moral, plus infinity. What we have shown is that our little model encompasses, in some sense, basic versions of the two major model systems within it. It's always nice when a model generalizes previous types of models under it, even if it's a bit rich to be calling these models in the mathematical sense of a model. Anyway, we aren't finished. When we don't fix big R for a particular action, a model represents a homotopy between a naive utilitarianism and naive deontology. What this means is that our little equation continuously deforms naive deontology in a naive utilitarianism, so in this sense it also captures everything in between. When defining an ethical system in modern times, we would like to solve the tension between the two major approaches to morality, deontology and consequentialism. Through the homotopy between a naive utilitarianism and naive deontology, our model may represent a possible way to do just that. So yeah, this is the other reason why I like calculating utility the way we do. Okay, some big words thrown out in this video, but the gist of it is really simple and I think really accessible. And yeah, lots of eudaimonia to all.